Hello, Hydroclimate 2K. Exciting news. Nick McKay, our chief lipid wrangler, has done our first big database update. So we've added about 30 new lake records. So they're now available in the updated master QC sheet. So they've moved from our folder 4 in lipid pending LiPDverse into folder 5, added to LiPDverse. So I thought I would take this opportunity to show you around a few things, show you the updated sheet, Master QC sheet, as well as a few very important tips to keep in mind as you are assessing records, adding metadata, and so forth. Okay, so I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, hide meeting controls. All right, so here is our project drive, which hopefully you're all familiar with. I think you will mostly have been spending your time in your archive folders, which are in here for whatever archive team you're a member of. But for our new QC sheet, so that lives where the master QC sheets are, in this folder here, QC sheets. So we can look here, and this is the updated sheet that has the new records added to it now. So the previous one, if you had a look at it, was 0.2.6. Now we have 0.2.7. So let's go in and have a look. So here it is. Remember in this, the master QC sheet, like your working QC sheets, there is one row for every variable of every data set. A data set being all the records from like a particular cave or a particular lake sediment core, things that are on the same time step might have been measured in the same core, but different variables. So, we've got a good example here. This is a Lake Alberca. So the 3 rows that I've highlighted here, that's one data set. You see all the data set level metadata are identical. That's colored in green, latitude, longitude, elevation, site name, all of that. But there are 3 rows because there are 3 different variables here. So in this case, it's titanium, calcium, titanium, and manganese versus iron. And so that is that. So somewhere in here, there are some new rows that correspond to the new lipids that were added to our data set. Very exciting. The other thing that is different in this Master QC sheet that Nick very kindly added for us is this column here, column P, which is called distinct years in the Common Era, and it has a value for that. So it's how many distinct or unique years there are within the Common Era for this record. And this is just a helper column. So remember that one of our criteria for including a record in the database is that it should have around 50 unique years within the Common Era. There's a bit of room for flexibility in that. I mean, if it's, 48 or something and you really want that record in, that of course is totally fine. That's up to you. Also, even more so if that's a data set that is in a place that is particularly poorly represented. Otherwise, it's also fine to have a bit of flexibility, but broadly 50 is our cutoff. And so that value is available for you here as you're going through and screening any of these records that haven't yet been screened for your archive, which is most of them. I've done some pre-filtering here for you. So I've filtered out all variables in here that had fewer than 30 unique years in the Common Era. So I think fewer than that, no matter what, we won't want them in. But if it's between 30 and 50, or in fact 30 and more, I've left them in there for you to have a look. The other thing, so that's the new Master QC sheet. I'll come back to that in a second. But what we also have here is, so this is, you can go in and have a look at our actual database, which is, it's essentially a collection of lipids. So you can get to that at the web address here. So the LiPDverse, Hydroclimate 2K and current version, and you'll get to something like this, where you could download the database in whatever format you like. So a serialization for R or Python, just a collection of lipid files, which is generally how I work with it, even in R. There's this really handy feature that Nick showed me that I think he's added relatively recently, which is a project bibliography. And this is super neat. Remember that one of the aspects of metadata that we include for all our records is the publication information, so like a DOI and various things. And that actually can be used to generate something like this, which is actually a bibliography listing all the publication information for every record that makes up our database. And so this sort of thing will be really useful down the line, you know, when we write publications or other people write publications using the database. So it makes it easier to actually cite every individual data set used, so all the authors get the citations they deserve rather than just citing the database. So that's a cool thing. Now, the keynote amongst you might notice, so this map here shows the location for the data sets that are currently officially included in the Hydroclimate 2K compilation. And you can see that it's actually, it's not very many, right? This map is quite sparse compared to what we've got in our master QC sheet. And that is because the lipids that are included in the database, if you downloaded the database, are only where that data set has one or more variables that are flagged true in this extremely important column, which is called in this compilation. So I'm just going to quickly run through again what this means. So remember that a data set can include many different variables. And if an author publishes, you know, 4 or 5 variables for their core, we want to keep those all together. But in many cases, not all of those variables will primarily reflect hydroclimate. And that's totally fine. That in this compilation field is how we deal with that. So this is probably a good example again, this Alberca lake, which here has 3 variables. Let's see. And I think in this case, I've assessed this over in our lake sediment working QC sheet, but I think 2 of these reflect primarily hydroclimate. And the third one, which is the ratio of manganese to iron, actually reflects the redox conditions in the lake, so it does not. And so what we would do here is it would have a true flag in for both of these variables that reflect hydroclimate and a false flag for the variable that is there but does not primarily reflect hydroclimate. And so when you're going through, so I know some of you are working on identifying new records to add to the data set, and others, like what I'm mostly doing, are going through all of these in here that were inherited from previous databases, things like ISO2K, Coral Hydro 2K, CITL, various others, and assessing those for inclusion. When we're doing that, so say we've got a record here, it's extremely important that as part of your metadata entry, you fill in this compilation field as to whether you want that variable in our database or not. Because if there's a data set where there are no flags in here, an empty field is equivalent to false, then that data set is not showing up or won't show up as part of our compilation. So we need to have a true flag if we want that variable to be part of our database. Okay, and so one of the, I think sort of largely to date, you have mostly, I think, been working in your working QC sheets. And this is just because so this is the master QC sheet. When a change is made to this master QC sheet, that change is propagated through to the actual database. So the next time this QC sheet is used to update the database, that change, the lipids will be altered according to what is in this sheet. So just say here I changed this to a coral. If this was used, if Nick did a database update, then this particular variable would be called a coral rather than a speleothem. So that's just a reminder to, when you jump in and start putting metadata in this master QC sheet, to be careful, because the changes that you make here are officially going into the database. The other thing is you might find it easier when you're sort of playing around in here to do a bit of filtering, like you might want to, only show corals or whatever. That's totally fine. Just remember that when you're done, to remove any filtering or, re-show the columns you hid or whatever when you're done, because the changes that you make here will affect how everybody sees the master QC sheet. This is just one sheet that the entire project is using. So just for an example, let's see. So I work in the Lake Sediment Archive group. And so here we have our working QC sheet. So I think this is where you'll all be sort of doing your metadata entry. This is what I call the sandbox. So here, seeing as you've got a bunch of lakes that people are working on, this is where you would sort of, where you're going through the papers, pulling out the metadata, figuring out what should go in each column. You can see here, lots of these are very nicely filled in. We've got information in the sort of environment interpretation, in the climate interpretation, even if you're in the dynamical system. So we've got quite a lot of flags here in this compilation field. Sorry, there we go. Remember, we also have we have our workflow overview sheet that the Lake group are using very nicely. And so here's all the data sets that we're working on in the Lake group at the moment. So here at this stage, all metadata added to our working QC sheet. You can see we've got quite a lot of lakes where that's the case. So sort of all these lakes here. These are ones where whoever's working on that record has finalized the metadata, they're happy with it. In case, if that's you, you can feel free now to copy that metadata in to the master QC sheet over here. And that means that in the next database update, that will be officially added to the master QC sheet, and we will get some information in these columns, which are currently still completely blank. Because all that happened to the last update is we just added some new data. Now, there were a couple of other things that I wanted to say. What were they? Oh, yes. So the update mostly went really well. Everything went pretty smoothly, which Nick was very happy about. The only thing was that there were a couple of lipid files that people had made that were actually duplicates of records that already existed in the LiPDverse, which is not a problem. It's just a duplication of effort. And this is something we really want to avoid. So just remember that when you ask, if you're someone who's working on adding new records to the database, rather than sort of going through and adding metadata to ones that are already in the QC sheet or assessing them as to whether they should be here, the first thing you want to do before you go making a new lipid file is to check that that data set doesn't already exist in the LiPDverse. And the easiest way to do that is actually in this second tab of the master QC sheet down here, which is called Datasets in Compilation. And so here, this tab, Datasets in Compilation, lists every single dataset that exists in the LiPDverse. So see, it's about just over 7,000 data sets. And this is just one row per data set. So not, here we have a row for every variable, here we have a row for every variable of every data set. This is just one per data set. And it's listed by data set name. So just say you found a really cool new record, but you just need to check first that it's not already, it's maybe not in the QC sheet where you would check first. You can also check if it exists in Lipid, just do a quick Control F and say it's something like /Mars Lagoon. Oh, look, there it is. Okay. It exists. So you wouldn't make a new Lipid file. And so what you would do if you found that there's a record you've sort of identified in the literature, it's not showing up on our master QC sheet, but it does exist in the LiPDverse. It's listed in this column here. This column here, in comp, that is whether or not that data set is currently showing in our master QC sheet. So say it was this record here that you wanted to add in, you would simply change its entry from false to true, like that. And then the next time the database is updated, that record, all of the variables associated with that data set will appear in the master QC sheet. And you could go ahead and add the metadata, making sure, of course, that you put the relevant true or false flags in this compilation field. So hopefully that makes sense. That's just a good way to screen whether or not a record you're considering adding to our database, even if it's not in the master QC sheet, if it does actually exist already elsewhere in the LiPDverse. Okay, that is that. Now I'm just going to check if there's anything I have missed here. Yeah, I think that is mostly it for now. The highlights reel is that we've updated the database. If you're at a point where you're ready to do this, you've been thinking about metadata, you've been working on some records, feel free to jump in and add that metadata now to our actual official master QC sheet. Just make sure you've done that quite carefully. And the best way to do it, of course, is to, do all the mucking around, filling in the metadata in the working QC sheet, which would be an exact duplicate, more or less, of the master QC sheet in your archive folder, and then copy it over to the master sheet. Don't forget this very important in this compilation field, which actually tells the sort of code that makes the database whether or not a particular variable should be considered part of our database. Remember to check before you make a new lipid that record. So this is, we always use the same format for a dataset name, which is the site name, full stop, author, full stop, year of publication. Just check that it doesn't already exist. Here are the lipids if you want to have a look. And I think that is everything. Right. So that's that. Thank you very much again for your efforts. I hope everything is going smoothly. As always, feel free to reach out to myself or Matt or your archive leaders at any time if you have questions. And yeah, talk soon. See some of your AGU maybe. Alrighty.